before we begin our roundtable, I want to introduce to you our great friend from JP Morgan Chase, Verdi DeSessa, and he's just going to say a few words.
Thanks for the opportunity to say a few words this evening. I appreciate it. We appreciate it. My name is Verdi DeSessa, and I'm a managing director and part of the leadership team for the private bank here in Northern California at JP Morgan. We're incredibly grateful to be here as a partner with ARCS, an organization that's deeply committed to advancing science, technology, engineering, and mathematics achievement, not only in the Bay Area, but across the country through its affiliated chapters. Our community as a whole benefits when our local universities, and by extension their students, have the financial flexibility to pursue research in specific areas about which they are passionate. A few of these inspired demonstrations we saw here this evening. We want to extend a special thank you to Rita Milner and the committee for putting this on, to the ARCS leadership team, and to all of you for sharing this evening with us. And we all remain united in our support of the STEM community. Your investment of time and resources is instrumental to elevating the quality of research and innovation within our local universities and beyond. The Bay Area remains a beacon of progress in STEM, and the partnerships that ARC has built with its members, academic institutions, and the broader community is a big part of the reason why. As an organization, JP Morgan offers a multitude of resources to support life sciences, healthcare, and technology companies. We work with thousands of companies globally, both privately held and publicly traded, to offer support in any phase of their business. Not only do we provide startups with banking, lending, and treasury management solutions, but also offer capital markets guidance for companies looking to raise debt or equity. And in a similar fashion, our private bankers work with executives and founders of these specialized industries to provide holistic wealth management planning advice around income and estate taxes, stock options, executive compensations, and much, much more. While we highlight a few specific industries this evening, on a broader level, our local team can serve any personal wealth, corporate, or commercial banking need and are equipped to handle any level of complexity. We are incredibly proud of the support our firm and colleagues provide to the Bay Area. While we work closely with companies and individuals in these industries as professionals, we also donate countless hours of time, energy, and resources to advance the causes about which they care. Our team and firm are diverse, with many backgrounds represented, and are wonderful advocates for their communities. Thanks again to each of you, and especially to ARCS, for this partnership. With that, I'm very pleased to get out of your way and to introduce the first roundtable, Science Communications, the Difficulties, Joys, and Responsibilities of Science Messaging.
Welcome to ARCS Supernova 2024. Tonight's two roundtable discussions feature our outstanding scholars in interactive conversations with distinguished moderators. While these scholars are not necessarily experts in these roundtable subjects, they come from a variety of scientific fields, and each one has conducted thoughtful research on these topics in preparation for tonight. Following the discussion, there may be time for questions and answers. After the roundtable, please visit the scholars' posters, which are distributed around the City Club. These posters are a fascinating sketch of each scholar's field of study. Now, thank you for joining us at the ARCS Roundtable on Science Communication, the difficulties, joys, and responsibilities of science messaging. This discussion is sponsored by JP Morgan Chase. Please welcome our moderators. Elizabeth Crum, JP Morgan Life Sciences Commercial Banking. Erica Check Hayden, Director, Science Communication Program, Physical and Biological Sciences Division, UC Santa Cruz. And our scholar panelists, Amin Al-Jamal, Integrative Biology, San Francisco State University. Camille Derderian, Biochemistry, UC San Francisco. Julia Haranchar, Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, UC Santa Cruz. Mallory Harris, Biology, Stanford University.
Thank you so much. I'm Erica Check-Hayden. I am one of your co-chairs of this panel, along with Elizabeth Crum. We are very excited to talk to you tonight about science communication. It's ever more critical, ever more important, and ARCS has been visionary in supporting my program, the Science Communication Program, long before other people were interested in the topic. The program I run is at the University of California, Santa Cruz. It's a master's degree in science communication, and we're very unique in that we're the only program of its kind that specifically trains people with science and engineering backgrounds in communication. So we're very lucky and fortunate in California that we have this program and that it is within the public University of California system. Tonight, we have these 4 wonderful scholars who are going to talk about their work in science communication. But first, Liz, tell us about what's bringing you to this panel.
Definitely. Great to be here. Thanks everyone for joining us. Liz Crum, I'm the co-head of the West Coast Life Sciences team in the commercial bank at JP Morgan. And my team works with early stage life sciences companies on their banking journeys. So super excited, the non-scientist on the panel. So hopefully I can help translate things across the board. But thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much. And let's throw it over to our scholars. So I'd like to introduce to you Camille Derderian. She works at University of California, San Francisco. And our first question for our panelists and for you is, why did you want to serve on this panel, and how does it relate to your scientific research?
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Camille. I am a third-year graduate student at UC San Francisco. I am a basic biologist, and I study how cells can communicate to each other by building really specialized structures that they can use to kind of signal information from one cell to the next. And this kind of information that I study can be hard to kind of describe to people and communicate to others. It's hard to visualize, and I really care really deeply not only about sharing this information with my colleagues, but with other scientists outside of my field or to non-scientists, including both adults and children. And I think I'm really happy to be on this panel because not only is it something that I think is not necessarily emphasized in graduate school instruction, but also I'm really excited to share the ways that I've found that I can do this by teaching, by doing art, and those kinds of things. So thank you.
Thanks, Camille. We'll next hear from Mallory Harris from Stanford University, who's been doing interesting and slightly different work to Camille on science communication. So let's hear from you.
Cool. So I'm maybe going to be the Debbie Downer on the panel. I study infectious diseases. I started my PhD in fall of 2019. So really quickly, my research became more relevant than I maybe wanted it to be. And I was trying to communicate about what we knew about COVID, what we didn't know, and was sort of learning at the wheel how to go about that, and that it wasn't necessarily always just about sharing what the science said. Really early on, people had a lot of other concerns, a lot of other ideas about what was going on. So with that, as I was starting to get more involved in communication work, I also led a student organization called Scientists Speak Up, which led workshops and panels at Stanford specifically focused on science communication in a landscape that might not actually be very welcoming to all science. What is the actual environment that we're communicating in? And what do you do when you work in a topic that's maybe politicized or seen as partisan? How can you still get your message across and reach different types of audiences? So that's something I've been thinking about a lot. And then the third strand is that as I started engaging more and more with science communication and also learning about potential misinformation that people were receiving, I decided that I actually really wanted to study it as part of my dissertation. And that's one of the great things about ARCS is I had a lot of freedom to, as someone in a biology department, all of a sudden pivot a little bit and start thinking about social media and who were key anti-vaccine influencers and what that would mean for intervening and preventing misconceptions about vaccination. So I'm really excited to be here today and be talking with all of you.
Yeah, thanks, Mallory. And that, of course, that goes to the heart of the way that our information landscape is changing these days. So I think it's wonderful that young scientists are trying to explore how to navigate that. Julia Haranchar from University of California, Santa Cruz is next. She just reached an important milestone in her graduate studies. Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. I defended my thesis last Wednesday, or my dissertation. Thank you. So all the paperwork is signed, just a few more little bits of paperwork to clean up. But
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So tell us about how SciComm has fit into that.
I think like many scientists, I was first exposed to science communication through teaching and was immediately enamored with that process and sharing science with others, and whether it be peers in the early stages of my science education into teaching as a lab instructor and instructor. But as I began my PhD work and I do research in the tropics, I began thinking a lot more about equity in science and where we communicate our science and how far-reaching our science is. And became more and more passionate about cross-cultural communication and making sure that as we do research in other countries, that we're not just doing parachute research where we drop in and do our science and take all the information we glean back to wherever we came from, that we're sharing it on the ground. And from that inspiration, I've gone on to do a lot of training in teaching for equity and sort of the language we use and how we teach science, even within a university setting. But I think all of that, both communicating across cultures and equitably within a classroom, there are a lot of the same sort of underpinnings to those forms of communication. And I'm sort of learning more about how to draw those things together and thinking more, and excited to be here talking more about it and sharing how we can widen how we communicate science.
Right, fantastic, because that's such an important part of what we need to do is broaden the audience of people who we want to reach with information about science. And Amin Al-Jafar is in a master's program.
Jamal.
Sorry?
Jamal.
Jamar? Jamal, sorry. Amin Al-Jamal. Pardon me. Sorry about that, Amin. You're in a master's program at California Academy of Sciences by way, you said, of SF State University?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, so tell us more about how you've been communicating about your research and why that's so important to you.
Absolutely. So I'm an arachnid taxonomist. I name and describe new species of spider. But before I did that, I was an aquatic ecologist, mostly working on insects. And before that, I was a middle school science teacher. So for me, the two big constants in my life are little creatures with more than 6 legs and explaining things to people about little creatures with more than 6 legs. These are my two of my favorite things ever. And I'm especially, it's very, very important to me to early on instill, through enthusiasm and direct engagement with the natural world, not only scientific facts and information, but a scientific intuition. It's very important to me to teach kids how to think about scientific information.
Fantastic. And I know we'll be hearing more about how you do that shortly. Liz is going to take over.
Yeah, thank you for the overview. Let's dig a little deeper here. Camille, we'll start with you. What is the most joyful part of science communications for you?
This is a great question, very fun question, thank you. So I think a lot of us could agree that something really joyful about communicating science is when you see someone really get excited and lit up about learning something new and getting to engage with it with their hands. And an example of this is that throughout my graduate schooling, I've also been working in San Francisco public schools, designing science modules to teach to middle school and elementary school students. And this past year, one of the things we did was teach the students how to use cabbage juice as a pH meter. And so the students got excited even to just fill up little wells with a dropper with cabbage juice. And so the tactile nature of that and watching them connect and be able to read out a color change as the way that they're learning something new about the world was really exciting for both them and also for me, and really renewed a sense of excitement for me in my own work as well. So I think, yeah, just getting people to be really excited and know that they can access this information themselves and see themselves in the shoes of a scientist and imagine themselves having that career later in life.
I have a 2-year-old. There's no greater joy than watching her experience life, so definitely understand that. Mallory, the resident Debbie Downer, share with us some of the difficulties you've encountered with your science messaging.
Yeah, so one big one, which is what sort of inspired me to do research on this specific topic, is we often operate from this assumption that if people are doubting the science, let's say they don't want to get vaccinated, they don't think climate change is real, it's because they don't have enough information. And if we just get them more information, they'll change their minds. But what I was seeing play out in real life, and what I ended up finding through my research, is that often in these counter-consensus communities, and I was focused on the anti-vaccine community, you have a lot of people who at least look like they're experts. There are people with doctor in front of their name, people who have PhDs, and so the people listening to them actually think that they are listening to experts, and they are highly engaged with what they see as scientific information. And so that really changes then how you approach it, because it's not just saying, well, I'm a scientist and I disagree with that person, right? They can just show you another scientist. So that, I think, is one big challenge that we're just starting to learn how to deal with. It happened with tobacco disinformation, it happened with climate change disinformation, and it happened again with COVID. And one of the main interventions is focusing on the consensus of the scientific community. So like what Amin was saying, teaching people how science works. So not just saying trust the experts, listen to a scientist, you have to also tell them which scientists to listen to. You know, look out for conflicts of interest. Think about the scientific community at large as the person publishing in the field that they're talking about, and help people engage more with their critical thinking. But often as scientists, right, we're operating on a level below that, where we just want to talk about our research, not how we got to it or how our community understands the science. So that's what I see as a major hurdle right now.
I imagine that was quite the hurdle to take the adjustment of, I'm logical, I'm rational, this makes sense, and turn it into, maybe not everyone views it that way. And let's start at step one. Thank you. So Julia, what can scientists do to broaden the audience for science communications?
I mean, I think there's definitely several things. The one that has been very present in my life has come from this experience of going down to Latin America and doing research there, and wanting to make sure that I was communicating my science in Spanish to local communities. And so I presented at the local University of Panama, a cohort of biology students, and preparing for that talk, I think, was one of the most valuable lessons I've ever had in science communication, because my Spanish is good, it's conversational, it's not scientific. I didn't learn science words in Spanish, so it's very my vocabulary is very limited, and so I had to find ways to explain complex ideas in simple words. And I think that's something that, whether or not it's through being forced to do it in another language, we don't get that kind of education in science. And simple words don't equal simple ideas. And I think that's something that you maybe aren't directly taught as a scientist, but you're sort of, through assimilation taught that that's how scientists speak, and that's how we write about science, is in this totally impenetrable, difficult to read, difficult to understand manner, using the most jargon possible. And that's just not true. You can explain really complex ideas with really simple words, and that's a huge, immediately, hurdle that you can overcome to make your science more accessible, both within your own language and in other languages. And I think there's as you sort of progress in science, oftentimes if you have good mentors, there's some recognition of that where it's like, hey, I can't understand what you're trying to write down in this paper. And I've now had that experience as a mentor where undergrads are writing papers trying to sound smart. And it's like, you are smart. Just tell me what you know, like you were telling it to your peer, and that would be a much clearer way to communicate, even to me as another scientist. And so I think within the scientist community, we can do a better job of that, and then more broadly, and by simplifying our language, I think it also makes it easier for external community to start, external to science community to assimilate that information. But it helps scientists understand each other better and build this broader consensus and see where those connections are between fields, for example, where you may not share a common language, but you still share a common scientific method. So simplifying to, broaden over those shared bits.
Makes sense to me, and appreciate as not having a PhD. Simple. And Amin, what are the responsibilities in science messaging, and why is it so important?
This is a great question, and I want to start by going back to sort of what Mallory was saying, is that scientists, when they speak to each other, have a very different relationship to the information and what they're saying than when they speak to the public. And as a scientist, it's very easy to forget that when you're talking to someone else outside of your particular field, or a non-scientist, that you both as scientists share a preponderance of information, just tremendous amounts, sometimes a decade plus, just sort of general background information on cells and chemistry and sort of things that you've picked up along the way that you can just shorthand in conversations and kind of assume that the other person knows. And you'll just sort of zip through things that require a tremendous amount of context to someone who doesn't have the context. You know what I mean? And so a wonderful kind of ecological analogy I like to use is this ecological concept called Liebig's law of the minimum, which is best demonstrated by a bucket. So imagine a bucket with all these different sides, right? And they're all the size of my hand. If just one of those sections of the bucket is only half the size, how much water can the bucket hold? It can only hold half of its total contents of water. And it's actually very similar when you're communicating science. So you need to focus when you're communicating science. You need to kind of make an aim, and you need to say, whoever I'm talking to, they need to have this much background information for everything else that I'm saying to matter. So your priority one should be probing for that background information, trying to make sure that the person you're talking to has kind of the context necessary for everything else you're saying to make sense. And this goes back to what Mallory's saying when you're trying to do public science communication about medicine and things like that. It's a kind of a lot to ask of someone to just sort of believe what you're saying at face value without the tremendous amount of data you've seen and the training on interpreting that data. So, starting at the beginning and really understanding, laying the groundwork for whatever type of thing you're going to teach is just as important as the teaching of the thing itself. And I really believe that.
Yeah, I really appreciate the common threads here and the way you can link all of these and the interconnectedness of the communication. But Erica, I think you've got the next question.
Sure. So thank you so much for talking about this. And I realize that a lot of students like you're doing science communication. You've kind of had to figure it out either through classes or from learning informally from folks in your program or folks in your field. And you've made yourselves experts on it. And a lot of times you're doing this work and it's sort of seen as ancillary or additional to your research. And I know that sometimes makes it really challenging. So what I'd like to throw the question to all of you is, how can we as a scientific community improve our scientific communication messaging? And are there parts of our science education that we could address that would make more people able to do the work that you all are doing? Should we start with you, Camille?
Sure. Okay. Yes, thank you so much. So First of all, I think that courses in science communication are really important for graduate students to experience. In my graduate schooling now, we have a course that is optional to take, and I think it would be really amazing for that to be something that's really woven into our curriculum, because I think it's something we all do every single day. And I also think that on top of that, it's really important to include voices and perspectives of people that are not historically represented in the sciences so far, because they have so much knowledge and so much information that could not only benefit our gaining of all this new scientific wisdom, but also they can reach the community in completely different ways. Every different identity can do so, and I think that's very important to do.
Right, and that kind of connects with what Amin was saying about sometimes listening before you speak is really, really important. Mallory, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, so following this trend, this theme of listening, I've done a lot of listening in on communities that I don't necessarily belong to, with a lot of beliefs that I don't share. So kind of going into the darkest parts of YouTube and seeing what are people saying about vaccines there. And I think that I, as someone who's communicating on this topic, need to actually understand what some of my audience might be hearing and believing. So I'll often, when I'm talking with my friends in my program, be like, hey, do you know about this conspiracy theory about the work that you're doing? Like, have you heard about this? There are people who believe this about it. How are you going to respond to them? And I think we need to do a better job of really understanding the context of our work, also knowing history. So I talked about tobacco denial, climate denial, HIV denial is a huge one that I did a lot of reading about. I mean, we're in the Bay Area. It was and continues to be a huge issue that really kind of echoes what we then saw with COVID. And then the second part is empathy. So thinking about what are the parts of your work that might be confusing to someone else. I taught an undergrad class on representing infectious diseases and the stories we tell about them. And one of the homework assignments was to, based on data we'd look at in class, make like a really compelling anti-vaccine infographic and show people why the vaccines don't work. Because you need to understand the counter arguments that you are going to be coming up against so that you can then strengthen what you're going to respond. So I think, again, it's listening and it's empathy, but really kind of expanding which audience we're trying to appeal to.
Right, and that's really brave to try to extend yourself into that space of something that you really don't believe or accept. Julia.
Yeah, so I guess there's sort of two things I'll mention in how scientists can improve their own ability to be educators and share their work. One of the things I am currently a part of is summarizing articles that come out in the American Naturalist for their blog, etc. So I take in a lot of articles written by early career scientists who we connect with the scientists who wrote the paper, and we see this same challenge again where they try and basically rewrite the abstract. And the point is not to do that, it's to talk about the broader implications of the work, to have a discussion with the scientists who wrote that work about what they think it might mean, and going a little bit beyond that. And it's definitely something, it's obvious to me that early career scientists don't think that way on a regular basis. They aren't sort of pushing themselves to think beyond, like, here are my results, because you are taught very intensely to defend those results and be able to, like, point by point say, like, yes, this is why this is true. What does it mean, and how do you share that is, I think, still lacking. So it's been fun to work with both the scientists who wrote the original article and these writers of the summary to try and get them to, like, expand and work together to go beyond that. And the other thing I'll say is that there's a program I'm working with, and I'll mention it partially because I know the next panel is on AI, about using AI to translate abstracts into other languages and how that can be potentially really beneficial, but currently is still not very effective, right? Like, science is hard. It's hard to write a good abstract. It's definitely not simple to translate it into another language, and AI doesn't do a very good job. And so there are a couple different ways that we can remedy that in terms of, you can imagine that should we be able to use AI to make really good abstracts in all languages, that would really broaden the access to science. So one of the things that program is doing is finding first language speakers in the field to help verify abstracts written by people like me who are not first language speakers, but I can take a first pass and do it my best with the Spanish version, and then working with members of various different language communities to turn those into realistic abstracts, which can then eventually be fed into our AI, and the more of those good abstracts exist, the better the technology becomes at translating them itself. So those are sort of within science ways to do it. I'm very inspired by my panel members to think even more broadly than that in the future. It's been a delight to be here.
Fantastic. Amin.
I'm going to try to be a bit concrete here and say some things that I really think would help on an institutional level with schools. I think that science communication needs to be brought into the process of teaching science very early on. So if you have any professor friends, tell them for their undergrads, ditch some of the tests and ditch some of the tests and quizzes and all that, and not all of them, just some of them, and give them assignments to go and teach science to people, because presentations are not enough. Presenting to a class of a bunch of people who just learned the same thing that you did is not enough. You need to have the experience as a young scientist of going out to people who have no idea what you're talking about and being faced with having to construct the whole picture for them. It's crucial. It's really important. So start early, undergrad, or even before, honestly. High school would be great. Okay? It's really important to me. So, tell your friends in the teaching community. Seriously.
Fantastic. So, something you can all do after you leave the panel tonight. Liz, take us home.
So I actually think we have a few minutes for questions. Is there anyone in the audience? First hand up.
It's frustrating that so many people, after 50 years, are still climate deniers. And, recycling paper isn't going to do it. So how do you, so many smart people have been beating their chests and their heads against the wall for decades. Meanwhile, we know, like the tobacco companies, I won't even go into other lobbies, how there's been disinformation that has been funneled purposely so that we can keep going backwards. How do we do it?
I can certainly jump in, but what thoughts do you all have?
Well, way to ask an easy question. I think I think about that a lot too, and I don't feel like there is a silver bullet answer or someone would have figured it out. I feel like the only thing I've seen work is going back to what Amin has been saying, is when you talk to an individual person, relating it to their personal experience, right? Does that always work? No, but if you're a farmer in Texas and all of a sudden your crops aren't growing because you've had such severe drought for the last 3 years, all of a sudden you stop ignoring climate science. That's the only thing that I feel like I've seen, is when people can directly connect it to the lives of deniers, it seems to be the only time that those deniers change their mind. I think another question is whether or not we actually need to change all the deniers' minds to make a difference. And I think that is potentially a far more effective way to get climate action, is by talking to the people who will listen and going from there and working on technologies that they can't, that deniers can't stop you from developing science that will improve things.
I'll maybe chime in with actually a silver lining for the evening. So we've talked a lot about how you have the same denials, some of the same industries over and over propagating the same lies. And that's actually something that we can use to our advantage. So there's research done by John Cook and other psychologists where you teach people about the disinformation campaigns waged by the tobacco industry as their example and the tactics that were used. And then you have people read a bit of climate denial that uses the same tactics, and they found that people were less likely to believe the climate denial once they had learned about the tactic. So this is called pre-bunking or inoculation. It's often compared to vaccination, where you give someone a weakened dose of the disinformation that they might encounter out in the world, help them walk through, they call them cognitive antibodies. Like, how are you going to debunk this when you see it? How do you see that it's wrong? And then when they encounter it in their lives, which they are going to do over and over again because there's so much garbage out there, right? Then maybe they'll be a little bit more resilient. So this is a tactic that's being tried out more and seems to be potentially more effective than always having to chase down piece by piece by piece.
I would just add that I think part of the solution here is what you were talking about, Julia, about broadening the audience. I think part of the problem is in the past, we haven't spoken to everyone about how this actually impacts people's daily lives. We haven't included enough, diversity in the conversation about climate change. So I think that's changing now, and that's really important. Great question.
Any more questions out there?
Beyond communicating with colleagues, with members of the public, with your students, there's that other art of communicating your science to investors, whether angel investors or venture capitalists, and that of course entails some other approaches. Where would you appoint someone who has his team, who has his product, to communicate effectively with those who might help them monetize it?
That's that.
Yeah.
Good.
This is something that's very non-intuitive for scientists, but I think that focus on discover the things about your work that are relatively easy. It's so funny because I think scientists often immediately dilate to challenges in their own work. What's going to cost the most money? What's going to take the most time? What's going to be the most difficult? But the truth is that to an outsider that isn't worrying about your issues, there's also a whole bunch of benefits to what you're doing, things that relativistically are quite easy. You know what I mean? So to give an example for me as a taxonomist, one of the wonderful things I can say is that looking through a microscope to count hairs on spider legs, well, it does take a lot of time and a lot of training, does not take a lot of crazy technology or machinery or startup capital. You know what I mean? So I would say each researcher should take a moment to kind of count all the things that are easy about what they're doing, which is something that people very rarely do.
So, certainly not speaking on behalf of my employer, but I would say start with the conclusion that so many people get caught up in telling their story and how they got there and on the journey. And if people don't understand the steps, then you lose them before you get to the end. So the too long, don't read, this is what we're trying to solve, this is why it's great, and then get the investor money and solve the rest of the problems. So I think it's absolutely the science communication. How are you describing to people who don't know what you're doing, that haven't spent the time, and to Amin's point earlier about the bucket, if people don't understand the background, so how are you putting that in a way that makes sense, that is meaningful, and will be worth a lot of money in the future? I think we have time for one more question. Going once? Going twice?
I have a follow-on question for Amir. Why do you count hairs on spider legs?
Oh my goodness. So this is a great example of a question for which the bucket is like theoretically miles deep, but the very, very basics of it is that for any sort of taxonomy where you're trying to delineate species and tell them apart from each other, there's going to be some salient features, and at first you might say, well, this thing is pink and this thing is green. but often those are deceptive. And one of the jobs of a taxonomist trying to suss out all the species from each other is figure out what traits are really important. And it turns out for tiny little animals, often it's very esoteric features like configurations of hairs on the undersides of their mouth parts and things like that. So you really just chip away at traits and say, is this useful, is this useful, is this useful? And eventually you'll get down to a trait that actually is useful, and it's often something like that.
On that note, so just want to give a quick recap of the things that I learned from the panel here. And also, number one, you must speak loudly if you would like to be heard, but also it's very important to listen and understand where your audience is coming from. We need to start our science exposure early. We need to provide technical training. And we need to teach. That's how we learn, that's the exposure, that's how we really know if our message is getting across. So I'd like to thank you all for attending today. Thank you to our scholar panelists. And a huge thank you to Erica, who was my guide on this journey. So lovely to see you all.
And to Liz, who was really masterful at organizing all of us. So I appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.